Belief in the Christian faith in Canada is reaching all-time lows, with churches whose pews were getting sparse now empty due to COVID restrictions. Pastors have been arrested, congregations fined, and now this community, desperate for a place to practice their faith, have been met with a summer of horrors. Terror attacks on their churches like nothing we have seen before in Canada. Not simply a few arsonists or rogue graffiti attacks, dozens of churches under siege by fire, rock, and paint. Over 64 Canadian churches have been vandalized or burned in the last few months. Where did this begin, though? What sparked this great hatred towards the Christian community? Well, unlike other events in history, there was no grand assassination, no kidnapping, surprise bombing, political revolution, or protest. No, this wave of hate began with a single tweet. May 27th this year, the Kamloops Today released a tweet reading, "Tk'emlúps confirms bodies of 215 children buried at former Kamloops Indian Residential School." Following this tweet, the Vancouver Sun, Global News, CBC, and soon the worldwide press began to take to this story like wildfire. One by one, building on that single article and announcement, and soon the story took a life of its own, evolving into a tale of mass graves. New York Post, Washington Post, CTV News, and even The Sun all published headlines touting horrors of mass graves in Canada, with even political leaders hinting at a Canadian genocide. The legal definition by the United Nations states that mass graves include 3 or more bodies buried in one spot who were victims of extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions. And the media weren't just talking about a handful of people in a mass grave. They were asserting over 1,000 bodies had been discovered in mass graves across the country, conjuring images of a Canadian mass slaughter deliberately covered up for decades by the government and, in particular, the Catholic Church. The fury over what people saw as a Canadian genocide eventually turned from tweets to screams to protests and then to violence. But what if we were to tell you that all of this chaos, anger, and violence was for nothing? Journalist at the Countersignal, Kian Bext, and I have been reading and researching stories about church burnings and mass graves for the last few months, and things were just not quite adding up for us. As we looked further into the information, it appeared the stories being told by journalists and activists were missing crucial questions and evidence to support their narratives. If these were mass graves, for example, why would Dr. Sarah Bellier, the woman who conducted the ground-penetrating radar test in Kamloops, state that her findings presented unconfirmed individual graves? If these were mass graves, why would tribal chiefs be stating these were overgrown graveyards? If this were a mass cover-up by the Catholic Church, where is the evidence for the cover-up? Why did all of this come out now when most of the graves bolstered in the media were already well known and never referred to as mass graves in the past? And all before an election. Things were simply not adding up. So we decided to go to the source of all this chaos. Before we even made it to Kamloops, myself, Kian, and some old university friends had made multiple attempts to contact the Tk'emlúps band for an interview, or even just a single comment, seeing as they were ground zero for the mass graves story. They were impossible to reach, and seemingly intentionally so.
Your call has been forwarded to the voicemail for Roseanne Cosinier. Please leave your message after the tone.
And I called yesterday and was told that I could be put in contact with a media representative or Chief Roseanne Casimir. to ask about,
Okay.
any updates.
I'll put you through to Carrie. Not available to answer your call at the moment.
Hey, I'm recording this, by the way. I called both of Roseanne's numbers, her personal cell, her office number. We did it yesterday as well, and just gotten nothing from the emails. I just called the secretary, and she picked up, and she said, oh, awesome, I'll forward you to Roseanne's assistant. And then Roseanne's assistant didn't pick up. They're in the office, I think, though. Like, the way the secretary sounded, it sounded like they're all in the office. Just no one's picking up their phone.
What are they hiding? Like, why are they so afraid to talk to media? You know, like, they have this whole story that they want to get out, I presume.
Yeah, and I'm not even being hostile. Like, I'm just like, hey, like, I haven't even told them what I want to ask yet. I'm just like, hey, can I talk to a media representative, anyone? And they don't even know who I am when I call. So it's just like, what is going on?
Sounds like what's happening is only, you know, very prescribed mainstream media pieces can be released about this with anything on the record.
Yeah.
Every time I called, I was forwarded to voicemail again and again and again and again, even when the people I was calling were in
No
the
one is
office.
available to take your call.
Sydney, Ben?
Is anyone in the office? Like, if I called back in 15 minutes or something?
She's here, but I did try calling her and it rang.
So the secretary kept forwarding me to each and every individual spokesperson she could, to no avail.
Not available to answer your call at the moment, please.
You have reached Roseanne Kasmer.
With the Tkemlips band being so crucial to the beginning of the mass graves narrative, Kian and I were determined to hear their side of the story. And he figured with my calls falling through, he would go to their offices to meet them face to face.
Office is behind the gated fence that says closed to the public.
Are you for real?
And, yeah, like it's behind that fence that we were at yesterday.
So the office to talk to people to get information for this is also blocked off where they work. So people literally can't go find them in person.
No. Without trespassing.
During my call with Kian, I finally received contact back from a tribe representative who let me know they couldn't answer my questions over the phone, but they could get back to me if I sent an email to their media team within 1 to 2 days.
I look forward to seeing your email.
All right, I'll send that right now.
Okay.
All right, bye.
We never received a response to that email. Yeah, so it's been 26 days now since I sent the email to the Kamloops band, and they said they would reply within 1 to 2 days, and I followed up. I don't know what to do. Like, I would love to have a comment from them in this story. I don't want to give them no voice or platform here, but like, I don't know.
I mean, that's good of you, I guess, as a journalist. You did your job, though, right? Like, they're obviously satisfied with the existing narrative that it has been played, that has been spoken to the world by the mainstream media. Every story that said there was mass graves, they read all those. They know they exist, and they don't care to speak out about it and correct the narrative. You've given them the opportunity to do that. We've given them a month, actually, and they're satisfied with the status quo. So that's the story, right? They're happy with you being misled. They're happy with the general public not actually knowing what happened, and that's why this documentary is important. We need to correct that narrative.
This total information lockdown was not just the case with the Indigenous band, but churches as well. People seemed terrified of answering questions. Local churches had even hired 24/7 security, which would not allow us to stand within 10 feet of their building in broad daylight.
Yeah, just for media. You can take pictures of it, that's fine, just on that side.
Oh, okay. Why are we not allowed on the property?
That's why I'm here. Everybody is. Nobody's allowed to go.
Oh, okay. Is it because of all the church attacks happening?
It's just the line, right?
Really?
So what we got told was just like the line here, nobody sits here.
So are you here at like nights then?
All the time, 24/7.
I don't suppose you'd be up for an interview?
I'm good.
No worries, thanks.
Hello?
Hi there.
Are you with the Ukrainian All Saints Orthodox Church?
Yes.
Hi, I've been calling a few of the numbers there. My name is Lauren. I'm just a journalist in town from Vancouver, and I'm doing some stories on the church vandalism and arson attacks across Canada. And I was just wondering if anyone from the church would be willing to speak with us or give us a statement.
Right now, I honestly kind of things are kind of busy. We've got a lot on our plate.
No worries.
So I'm gonna at this time say that we're not able to help you out with this.
It's almost weird. Everyone that I'm calling or trying to contact about this is like insanely nervous to give any comments on the story, and I think it's because no one can actually say what they're thinking.
And the security guy too.
Yeah, even the security guy. It's just
Yeah.
no everywhere we go, and I think it's literally because you cannot. He's probably scared of his church being attacked again. If he says
if he says
anything. In other stories I do, or in other communities I go to, if I do streeters, people are like, "Oh yeah, what do you want to chat about?" This topic, I literally hear like the soul leave their body when I ask about the church attacks
Yeah, I know.
or the
He
residential
got
schools.
like choked over the phone. You could feel it. Like he's just like, yeah, no, not right now.
Yeah.
We're busy. It's like
they have a line about if you need to call about pierogies. Like you can't
be
that busy. And I don't blame him though. Like it's
Like you
there's
said,
one
like-
narrative that's been told publicly: the church is evil, and this was a mass grave situation, and that's all you can say. Defending the churches is seen as an attack against indigenous people.
We don't
almost.
know if it was a mass grave.
Yeah, we don't even know that, but
Yeah.
that's the public narrative. That's the
that's
only
the
thing you can
story.
say. It's crazy.
Shame on them, basically.
Yeah.
They deserve what's
Well-
coming to them.
Let's see if we can get anyone to talk to us.
Vroom vroom.
Stranger yet, though, was the residential school investigation site demanding no filming, no live streaming, no drones, basically no follow-up investigation whatsoever. And of course, this would absolutely make sense if they didn't want people to step onto the site of an active archaeological investigation, but their gates and hired security blocked off the offices as well, ensuring no one could even speak to the receptionist. So it was fully quarantined from any outside investigation over phone, email, visual, face-to-face, and perhaps, to be the best of faith, they only wanted to be reached on professional levels. Fair enough. But we already tried that, and it was no's all along the way. So we decided we needed to find out what the hell was going on. This was one of Canada's largest international stories in years, and there hasn't been so much as a peep about further investigation. And what we found could explain perhaps some of this.
So what are we doing right now?
We are about to launch the drone to fly it over this area that a lot of people don't want to be seen for whatever reason. I'm not sure.
Tails and retro, good to go.
They said we're good to go?
Or are you guys good to go?
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, there's a flag.
There's two flags.
There's markers, yep. Okay, so these are, some of those markers are real close to each other.
The question is, oh, there's more. Okay.
Okay, so they have
Now we
marked
see
this
it.
whole area. Some of those markers are like weirdly close to each other.
Now, what we need to do is speak to an expert on ground penetrating radar and see if that level of preciseness
Yeah.
is accurate, or are they just putting stakes in the ground?
The GPR scan, which presumably led to these flag markings, was done by Dr. Sarah Bollier, who has since stated her findings are simply preliminary and cannot be confirmed yet.
In the following slides, I will call the targets of interest probable burials as they demonstrate multiple GPR characteristics of burials. but only forensic investigation with excavation will be able to conclusively determine this.
Hey, Kian, how's it going?
Not too bad. How are you?
Good. So it's been a few weeks now, but you've done a bit of digging into the GPR stuff.
Yeah, so I found this really interesting study from the Journal of Applied Geophysics. This was from 2009, and it talked about, how GPR works. And it says, here's a quote from it. It says, whilst the method is rapid and does not involve disturbance of the graves, the interpretation of GPR profiles is nevertheless difficult and often leads to incorrect results. Incorrect identifications could hinder criminal investigations and complicate burials in cemeteries that have no information on the location of previously existing graves. The point here is that you can't just rely on a couple squiggly lines to condemn a nation of genocide. That's not how it works. That's not what the science says. But time and time again, we see journalists misreading science. They don't know what they're talking about. They claim they do, but they're lying.
So, yeah, one of those things that was repeated by almost every study and every expert, even the experts who did some of the research on these graves, was it cannot detect organic matter.
Yes, exactly. So organic matter in the ground, you're not going to see that. If there was really this mass grave in the middle of Kamloops, you wouldn't see it. The ground penetrating radar finds anomalies in different types of substrates. So, if there was a gap in concrete, it would see that. Like if there's air between concrete, a foot of it, it would see that. It wouldn't see a dog that has been buried and has been there for 100 years. Doesn't see that. Doesn't see a human body that's been there for 100 years. It might see a coffin, if someone was buried in a proper Christian burial with duty and care paid to it, it would see that. It would see that coffin. It would see a tombstone that was underground, but it wouldn't see a pile of bodies that has been there for 60, 70, 80 years. It's just not how GPR works.
Right. Yeah. From what I've seen, looking at some of the studies available online, really, it'll just show you anomalies in the ground. And this is even what Sarah Bellier, the investigator in Kamloops, said. It'll just show you literally like a squiggly line on the graph. And she can interpret that to say, oh, maybe that could be a grave, that could be a burial site. But it's very clear in all of the research available, you cannot confirm these things without exhumation. And most importantly, you don't know the stories. You don't know if this is a graveyard. You don't know who is buried in it. You don't know if it's children, adults, a dead dog, if it's people that died from tuberculosis, or you have no idea the story. So why these journalists are making such substantive statements about this is 100% children that were murdered, mass grave, blows my mind.
Yeah, you said that exactly right. With GPR, you might not even know that a grave is there. You might have a false positive on a grave site. But one thing it certainly does not tell you, it doesn't tell you how the person died. But is this a mass grave? No. Are these people that died via genocide? There's just no way to tell.
Yeah. And the media have just taken the story and run with it. Run with it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is what they do though, right? They embellish a story for clicks. Or for the political benefit of their friends.
GPR is an incredible technology, but it has its limitations, and our drone footage shows the necessary exhumations to confirm any findings or apply cause to potential burials simply have not taken place yet. But many refuse to let this fact get in the way of a good narrative.
215 Indigenous kids were found in an unmarked mass grave. Anytime we think about unmarked mass graves, we think about a distant country where a genocide has happened. This is not a distant country. This is here in Canada.
The irresponsibility of our elected officials and media in the Kamloops case has been galling. But shockingly, the Kamloops case is far from the most erroneous story. While there's certainly no mass grave in Kamloops and no evidence of genocide, they may still yet find bodies buried and investigate that history. As for the largest mass grave, or unmarked graves found in Canada, 751 children's bodies in Saskatchewan, This story isn't just unconfirmed reporting, it is straight up hearsay and fiction.
Good evening. In the northwest corner of a former residential school in Saskatchewan, a very private and sacred ceremony today for the unnamed hundreds who lie in unmarked graves.
The implication here, of course, is a continuation of the mass graves narrative, that bodies were buried in secret with no markers to cover up some nefarious deaths at a residential school. The only problem with this story? These graves in Saskatchewan were apparently marked in the 60s. This was not a mass grave, it was a graveyard. These were not secret unmarked burials done by the Catholic Church or residential school, nor were they all children. From the available information, it appears as though this was simply a community graveyard, which over time lost its markers.
The people here say it's important to remember that the unmarked graves belong to not just residential school students, but also the people that lived and worked here in the community who are from the surrounding area. Sandy.
All right, Creason, thank you.
Clearly, the fact that this is simply a graveyard is an extremely important piece of information to distinguish, but this information was swept under the rug, and the 751 bodies in a graveyard became 751 children from residential schools whose deaths and graves were not just unmarked, but deliberately covered up by the Catholic Church. Even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau visited the site and claimed this was Canada's responsibility to bear. Chief Cadmus Delorme solidified this narrative of malicious cover-up in multiple interviews, claiming the Catholic Church deliberately removed the markers.
In 1960, there may have been marks on these graves. The Catholic Church representatives removed these headstones, and today they are unmarked graves.
The chief's story is already confusing. He says in the 60s there may have been grave markers, but then asserts the Catholic Church definitely removed these headstones. How could he know this for certain if he's uncertain if the graves were even marked before? Every article I read implied that the headstones at the cemetery were in fact removed by the Catholic Church, but given the misreporting on the Kamloops case, I wanted to delve into every detail given, and sure enough, they did not add up. The primary article from the Sask Today, in which the Church takes blame, states, "The Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Regina confirmed that in the 1960s, a priest serving in the region had bulldozed several grave markers during a dispute with the Cowicist chief, in a way that we all find entirely reprehensible." This story, quite frankly, left me with even more questions. Firstly, a rogue priest with a bulldozer is not an intentional cover-up by the Catholic Church, nor a mass grave. But also, the story states he only destroyed several graves. So I decided to contact the Archdiocese of Regina myself, and as it turns out, reporters were not being entirely honest about what the church had said. My first question asked is if it were true the church removed the headstones. Their answer? We do not have any information at the Archdiocese regarding the removal of headstones or grave markers. The information that has been shared about the removal of some of the markers by a local oblate priest was relayed to us by members of the Cowicist First Nation itself. So the information about this priest was not confirmed by the church. They did not even know about him, and there is no information or proof regarding this disturbed priest on a bulldozer other than hearsay. My second question to the Archdiocese asked about the Sask Today article directly. The answer to this is essentially the same as above. The story in the Sask Today was not entirely accurate in making the claim that we confirmed the story of the headstone removal. They were simply told what I had said above. Members of the Cowicist First Nation have told us this is what happened, and we do not have any records to the contrary. But they don't have any records confirming this either. No one does. My last question regarded how the Archdiocese felt about the media coverage in general. He states, "Much of the struggle with secular media outlets comes from a lack of understanding regarding how the church is structured They do not, for example, understand the distinction between a church or a school that is run by a Catholic religious order and one that may be run by a Catholic diocese. Each is a separate entity that, while sharing a common faith, operates largely independently from one another with no avenue for shared oversight. In spite of this, both are labeled as the Catholic Church in many media stories, which is the source of confusion for a great many, including journalists. The propensity to seek after sensation in today's media has resulted in some instances of disingenuous reporting, blurred or context-omitting details, and sensationalized headlines that do not accurately match the article content. But these instances are more generally a result of 21st century social media-driven approach to reporting than anything specific to the Catholic Church. Based on my research, I'm inclined to believe the information provided by the Archdiocese over the inconsistent hearsay of Chief Delorme, simply because the evidence available points to no motive for cover-up, as these were just normal graves. In fact, this community graveyard began its use in 1885, 13 years before the residential school in the area even began operating. Despite the horrible slander the church has endured at the hands of the media and Chief Delorme, they have continued to seek healing, with the Regina Archdiocese donating $70,000 to rebuilding the headstones, simply to respect the dead. So not only was the preemptive ground penetration scan in Kamloops completely twisted by the media to be confirmed bodies in mass graves, it appears the narrative of the Cowessess Cemetery, portrayed as unmarked graves of children and a deliberate cover-up by the church, was also spun with a total disregard for truth. In particular, a total lack of any evidence beyond hearsay which shows intent or action to remove these markers in the graveyard. It truly doesn't feel like any journalists have done any fact-checking when pursuing these grave stories, or perhaps they simply didn't want to. This can once again be confirmed by the reports of another mass grave in Cranbrook, BC, which were portrayed in the international media to be a horrific story and cover-up of a grave full of children at a residential school.
Now to Canada, where horrors from a different era have returned to haunt the country. Another mass grave of children has been unearthed, school children. And this is the third one since May. 182 unmarked graves have been found in British Columbia. More than 1,000 mass graves have been found in Canada. The findings have led to an angry backlash. But neither the Justin Trudeau government nor the Catholic Church wants to take responsibility.
In truth, yet again, these were simply graves in a graveyard. With the chief being very honest about the situation, Sophie Pierre, former chief of the St. Mary's Band, stated, "There is no discovery. We knew it was there. It's a graveyard. The fact that there are graves inside a graveyard should not be a surprise to anyone." Pierre further explained that wooden crosses were originally used to mark the gravesite, and they had been burned or deteriorated over the years, and that using wooden markers at a gravesite remains a practice that continues to this day in many Indigenous communities across Canada. Given this information, would it not make more sense to perhaps pursue further understanding or investigation before making claims of mass graves, murder, and cover-up? Would it not make more sense to exhume the bodies in Kamloops, find out who they were, find out how many, if any, and investigate whether this was a graveyard with potentially deteriorated markers before assuming and asserting in the media that bodies had been found and crimes committed? Would it not make sense to find out if this rogue priest at the Cowessess site actually existed, if there were any proof or reports of what he did or even who he was before reporting that he destroyed the grave markers? Would it not make sense to do a shred of journalistic work and simply state the facts as we know them instead of spreading one of the greatest hoaxes in Canadian history? We all know horrific things occurred at residential schools. We all know there was disease and abuse. Tragic conditions, unfortunately, all too common at the time for most children, though the removal of Indigenous children from their homes and the destruction of their culture stands, in its own right, a unique tragedy. There is no denying that the overgrowing of graveyards and signs that some graves have not been remembered properly is a tragedy, one we should work to remedy with investigation and repair of these sites. However, the media have irreparably damaged the ability for Canadians to address this issue logically. They have caused irreparable division between Christian and Indigenous communities who generally would have the same goals in wanting to respect and preserve the memory of our dead. Instead of healing, our political class and media chose to paint a narrative of genocide, a narrative of mass graves in which hundreds of children were murdered and thrown into pits to be forgotten, deliberately covered up by the church and government in an ongoing effort to hide atrocities committed against the Indigenous community. A horrific narrative which would inspire immediate action by anyone against the church and government for their continued crimes, and which has. The only problem being, absolutely none of this narrative is supported by fact. There were no mass graves, there was no deliberate cover-up, just a big lie. And thus we are left with dozens of burned churches, dozens of vandalized religious sites, hatred, protest, and division, which has brought us nowhere nearer to the truth and nowhere closer to healing. And worst of all, the media have done this to the detriment of the very people they claim to want to help and support. The unraveling of media lies will inevitably lead to a distrust in the stories told by Indigenous communities, not by any fault of their own, but due to a giddy political class gambling with the reputations of others for a quick headline, condemning a nation of genocide for political points in an election. And no Canadians deserve this treatment, Indigenous, Christian, or otherwise. In order to find truth, and in order to achieve justice, we must deal in fact. So long as we ignore that, we will only get violence at the behest of a false narrative which serves no one.